Hello, everyone. Just a little bit late, but I made it. I had a last-minute change of location, but now it is I, Dr. Campbell Price, Curator of Egypt and Sudan, here at Manchester Museum, speaking to you live from my office. I was previously speaking from the storeroom, but we've lost a good deal of internet connectivity down there. Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. There he is. Yes. Slightly late today. Hi, everyone. Last minute change of location, not in the store, which is something of a nuclear bunker for digital signals. So now I'm in the office. So, hello, everyone. Hope you're all keeping well. I'm now dividing my time between a little time at home and mainly in the office. Lots of exciting things happening. We're doing this, of course, remember, only once every month, last Thursday of the month at 2 p.m. So I'm happy to take questions at any time on social media at EgyptMCR on Twitter and Instagram, but I've got quite good at just telling everyone that I'm coming on a couple of days before. So thank you to everyone for the questions. Hello, everyone. Hello, Matt. Hello, Ross. Hello, Carl. Hello, Steve. I'm sure you're watching as well, but I can't see you. Hi. Thanks for all your questions. Quite a bumper crop this week, this month. So I'll try and get through them. Ross, hello, because I can see you in the chat. Ross asks an excellent question. I don't think I've answered it or provided an answer to it in the last 18 months since we've been doing this. Ross asks, why do you think there was and still is an obsession with ancient Egypt, especially in the 19th century? Whew. Well, Ross, it would take me an hour to give even a partial answer, but very shortly speaking, very briefly to say, I think there's a combination of the general knowledge of what we think of as knowledge of Egypt that comes through the Bible and classical sources. But in the 19th century, you're definitely talking about a colonial interest, because remember, kids, in 1882, Britain invaded Egypt. And as a result, Egypt was both part of our world, part of the British Empire, especially for British people, but also Europeans generally, and people in the West generally. But it was also an other, it was a different, exotic, dangerous, threatening thing. And it's the mixture of dangerous, weird, exciting, and familiar, something that we know about, something that we can cast in our own image. And this is something certainly I'm quite interested in myself. When you look at accounts of ancient Egypt, especially in the 19th century, they talk about them like, the imperial elite of Britain, of Great Britain. The Egyptians are seen to be white, Caucasian, middle-class people or upper-class people. And this fantasy persists right up until the present day. So it's that particular alchemy, the alchemy of taking something that's been discovered and reconfiguring it through the lens of modernity and making it resonant for the time. So you definitely get that in 19th century Gothic fiction. And because we're Halloween week this week, I thought I would highlight something. This is a quite wonderful birthday card, if you will. A birthday card designed by the Curator of Egyptology in the early 20th century, Winifred Crompton, for Mr. Jesse Howarth, major donor to the museum. That's his name there. And it has encoded within it the name of Queen Hatshepsut, Mat Ka Ra, as a rebus writing, known for Hatshepsut from her temple at Deir el-Bakri and other places, small 18th dynasty temple at Medina Habu as well. And as any regular viewers will know, I have a particular interest in Hatshepsut. I was asked by Carl, who's your favorite pharaoh? It would be Hatshepsut. Although he also asked, what would be your favorite dynasty? And I think probably 25th dynasty. They're quite cool as 26th dynasty. I'm quite a late period fan. But getting back to Hatshepsut, 18th dynasty, the reason she's featured in this birthday card for Jesse Howarth is because In the 1880s, Jesse Howarth goes to Egypt, very wealthy, starts to want to spend money on archaeology, and he acquires an object which he believes is the throne of Queen Hatshepsut. It's put on display at the Golden Jubilee exhibition of Queen Victoria in 1887. It's fated as it absolutely chimes in with the imperial air of celebration of a female monarch. And so people like Amelia Edwards, founder of the Egypt Exploration Society, she very much wants to see Hatshepsut as a proto women's liberation, early suffragist. But of course, we're viewing ancient people through a modern lens. The reason I mention this, and it connects a little bit to what Ross asked, why the resonance of ancient Egypt in the 19th century and today, there is something about these characters, these historical characters that emerge from ancient Egypt, people like Hatshepsut, because we have lots of evidence of them, but we can't really build a biography. That's not possible. And so it's left to writers, writers of fiction, novelists like Rider Haggard, like Bram Stoker. And Bram Stoker, in the early 20th century, 1903, so just into the Edwardian period, after the death of Victoria in 1901, he comes up with this story, The Jewel of Seven Stars. And that is, I recently reread it, absolutely fascinating take on British imperial guilt, because that's what motivates the mummy. The mummy, the Egyptian mummy, is seeking revenge for the intrepid archaeologist probing and in some ways raping Egypt, taking its treasures away and having colonial domination of the modern country. But it's the reason I highlight Hatshepsut and her name here is because Jesse Howarth thinks he's got the throne. In fact, it was probably a bed. The connection with Hatshepsut is not entirely clear. But Amelia Edwards believes truly this is the throne of Hatshepsut. Jesse Howarth is very proud of it. A couple of decades later, when Bram Stoker is writing his book, it seems quite clear to me that he bases the character of Tera, the protagonist, maybe the antagonist, of the Jewel of Seven Stars, this classic Gothic horror, Victorian Gothic horror, just post-Victorian Gothic horror, on the character of Hatshepsut. And the reason I think that is because there is a passage in Jewel of Seven Stars which describes furniture of Queen Tera, which absolutely is a description of the furniture associated with Hatshepsut in the Golden Jubilee exhibition, which I'm sure Bram Stoker would have been aware of. So this piece, this birthday card in honor of Jesse Howarth's 80th birthday, has a connection with Gothic horror and is therefore appropriate for me to show at Halloween. So I believe, Ross, you're doing some research on this, and I'll be very interested to know what you find out. So that, in short, is what I think. Jamie, hello, Jamie, if you're watching. I got some questions from you on Instagram. So Jamie asks, which my favourite movie mummy was, and why is it Christopher Lee? Well, Jamie, you're absolutely right. My favourite movie, Mummy, recreation on the silver screen of a mobile ancient Egyptian mummified body, is indeed Christopher Lee, because that was my first mummy film. And I remember watching it. I remember in the 90s, when you had to record things on VHS, a friend of my parents recording the 1950-something movie. Terence Fisher was the director. Peter Cushing, Christopher Lee. Christopher Lee is Karis, the baddie, who is the mummy, the eponymous mummy. And there is a scene, well, there are several scenes in it, which I really was terrified to watch. I mean, I loved ancient Egypt and I was totally here for the mummies, but that 1950s film in color has this, preternaturally tall. Christopher Lee, of course, was very tall, spindly, threatening mummy, and it's all in his eyes. He does the acting with his eyes, and when he comes out of a swamp and when he batters the window of the insane asylum, with one of the old Egyptologists who discovered his tomb of his princess Ananka is hanging out. That was absolutely terrifying. So if you want a good film recommendation for Halloween, The Mummy, 1950s something, Hammer horror, absolutely fantastic. So definitely that's my favorite mummy. Jamie also asks, this is very intriguing. I've never been asked this. Who do I think was the most liberal of the pharaohs? Who was the most liberal? Now, some people would tell you Akhenaten was liberal because, he was just swanning about at Amarna, not really caring very much. But I think Akhenaten was probably very draconian. I think he was very keen on authoritarianism. So I don't think he was particularly liberal. Based on evidence, and of course we have no real evidence of which pharaoh was liberal or not. I'm sure most of them were not in any way liberal, being rulers of large states. I'm sorry, I use that in inverted commas. But I would say, thinking about texts, I recently had an occasion to revisit the contents of the Great Harris Papyrus, in which Ramesses III, although it's written in the reign of his son, Ramesses III is described as having done good things, and there's a passage about he allowed, the women of Egypt to walk around safely. So if you're looking for evidence of, liberal, good guy kind of quality, I'd say Ramesses III, Jamie. That's as close to an answer as I think we can get. On the Halloween theme, Steve, hi Steve, if you're watching. Steve asks, regular viewer Steve asks, did the ancient Egyptians believe in ghosts, spirits, hauntings from, and this is interesting, those that didn't make the journey west? So what I think you're asking here, Steve, is those who don't necessarily successfully get into the afterlife. Well, this is an interesting thing, because when we think of ghosts in ancient Egypt, we think of the Aku, these spirits of action, who are believed to be, in a fuller rendering, are called the Aku Iker En Ra, so the effective spirits of the sun god. These are the spirits of the deceased who are believed to have gone into the afterlife and enjoy the companies of the gods, to sail in the solar bark with the sun god and hang out at the bar of this great celestial cruise across eternity. Now, if you've got a relative in that position, perhaps someone of significance during life who you believe would have passed into the afterlife successfully, you can petition them. You can petition their ark. So that's, I guess, more of the sort of, when we talk about spirits, we talk about the ark spirit being petitioned and asked questions. It seems that if you don't pass the judgment, you don't get into the West, you don't get into the fields of Yaru, and you don't get into the blissful existence of the beyond, you just don't do anything. You are negated. You don't exist. In which case, you're not in a position to haunt anyone because you have no spiritual capacity. You couldn't be a ghost. You couldn't be a spirit. But Steve, just to come back on it, I did have a think about this. You have texts like, for example, execration figures that have lists of enemies on. So you'd list, Libyans and Nubians and people you don't like. And you say, you want to kind of have control of these foreign groups. And amongst those listings of harmful beings, there are the dead. So that would rather suggest that there is a conceptualized threat amongst the dead. You also get it in the oracular decrees. They're more common in the third intermediate period, where you would have, again, a listing of protection against various entities, and the mutu, these moot dead people, and that, it seems to be a bad deadness. And I don't know, I'm sure there's more research on aspects of this I could look into, but my impression is, the Aku are the enlightened, solar beings that'll do good for you. Maybe the Mutu, the moot dead, are people who have a grudge and haven't in some way successfully made it over to the other side. Thinking about Halloween, I've got to mention the ghost story of a chap called Konsu M. Hat, and there's this idea that a spirit kind of wanders around if it isn't given offerings properly. If it doesn't receive a proper burial and proper offerings, it's kind of caught in limbo. And if you want a very vivid reimagining of this kind of thing, I've recently been reading a novel called Ancient Evenings by Norman Mailer. Norman Mailer isn't family reading. It's not for kids. Some very vivid imagery there, but he basically takes this concept of what happens if your tomb is damaged or you don't get offerings, what happens to your spirit, and it is one of the most vivid, kind of, in some way, fully realized fictional accounts of Egyptian spirituality. So I would recommend that, Ancient Evenings by Norman Mailer. Other Halloween recommendations: there's a superb collection of 19th century Gothic horror short stories issued a few years ago by the Egypt Exploration Society with the support of the Egypt Exploration Society, of which, of course, I'm very proud to be the chair of trustees. It's called Unearthed, and I think it's print on demand with an introduction by John J. Johnson. Really impressive collection of some of them rather less well-known stories, largely Victorian. Maybe Ross, you know about it. So then, Tony, hi Tony, if you're watching. I think you asked me this on Twitter. I hope you can get my reply. Tony asks, this is a more general question, not Halloween related. Have you been in a museum and seen something on display that's far more important than indicated or just a lovely hidden gem that needs more prominence? I've lost count, Tony, of the exciting things. And that is more possibly because if one specializes in a subject and gets a very specialized interest through your own research, for you, something will be significant. Maybe not for the general public. So plenty of times I thought, this is such an interesting thing. Gosh, I was in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford a few weeks ago, and I saw a couple of things that I thought, wow, it's not indicated just how important that is. But then again, the Ashmolean is full of objects which are very important. So curators can't describe, sadly, the significance of everything because there's not enough space and not enough panels and labels. But one of the things, just something recently in the Ashmolean, was a lovely little stone, very unassuming, with hieroglyphs on it, one or two hieroglyphs, or two or three hieroglyphs. And it wasn't indicated, but it is the case, because I know other colleagues who've done research on this, that these hieroglyphs write the name of an individual. And this guy was a priest at the site of Abydos, the sacred site of Osiris, god of rebirth and regeneration, appropriate, the original mummy, appropriate for Halloween in some ways. Someone can't hear me. That's annoying. God, I hope that's not a problem for everyone. Hopefully you can listen to a recording. It will be available on YouTube and also on Instagram afterwards. But I just love this idea of someone writing their name and then burying these stones around in the hope that they could be spiritually present for eternity, because the stone with your name on it, your unique identity, in this kind of sometimes cryptographic writing, which seems to have interested this chap Minmos at Abydos, who's himself a fascinating individual. I just like the idea that this was done with a kind of, a little bit of a nudge and a wink to eternity to say, I'm going to be here forever. So that was just an example at the Ashmolean. I mean, there's plenty in Manchester that's significant that's not on display, Tony, but that's due to space. And I guess the best thing to do is have temporary exhibitions and get things which are significant out and put them in context where you can with rolling and changing exhibitions. So thank you for that question, Tony. Question from a colleague, Dr. Sarah Docherty, who is just beginning a wonderful course with the Egypt Exploration Society, which is teaching the 10 worst jobs in ancient Egypt, which I think will be very informative. She asks the rather macabre question, Campbell, have there been any unusual deaths of the inhabitants of the Manchester collections, whether, actual inhabitants, mummified people, or people associated, I guess, with the museum collection? Well, we cannot for sure say much about the mummies. It is not as easy as perhaps people think to say how ancient people died based on mummified remains. But I know that one of my predecessors, Winifred Crompton, the first curator of Egyptology at Manchester Museum, appointed in 1912, she died in the 1930s going under a tram, which was a rather sad way to go. Very dedicated lady. I don't think any association with a curse was made at the time, although it was in the 15, 20 years after Tutankhamun. So who knows? Maybe there was something written about it. I've not found it. It's not related to a death, Sarah, but it is related to something unfortunate that happened to someone connected to the collection. So we have a little piece of jewelry called the Ricca pectoral, beautiful piece of golden cloisonné Middle Kingdom jewelry, probably worn by a female mummy, found by a team directed by Reginald Engelbach, which ended up here in Manchester Museum. There's a story from my predecessor, Professor Rosalie David, that in the 1980s, this piece, which had been found on the chest of a mummy, and Engelbach's team, when they found it, found another body next to it, the skeleton of another body next to it, which to all intents and purposes, I wasn't there, but Engelbach describes, looked like it was stretching out its hand towards the chest and the Ricca pectoral itself. And the second person, the other person whose remains were there, had been a tomb robber, crushed by the ceiling caving in. Now, if that was the case, then that's the most, extreme case of the mummy's curse in action we probably have. But so the Ricca pectoral had this association with something particular because it had been saved by the crushing of the ceiling, the collapse of the ceiling. It had not been stolen, at least not by the tomb robber. It had been taken out by archaeological finds distribution, ended up in Manchester. But in the 1980s, there was a burglary at the museum here. Someone smashed the case it was in and attempted to steal the jewelry in the case, including the pectoral. But they cut their hand on the glass, severed an artery, and there was a bloody trail going out of the museum. And apparently museum people phoned up hospitals asking if there were anyone with that particular injury had come in the previous night, but the culprit couldn't be found. But they didn't manage to steal the Ricca pectoral, so maybe there is something to that form of the curse. So finally, Carl, a question from Carl, and this is a big one, gosh. So Carl asked about my favourite dynasty, my favourite pharaoh, I've told you, Hatchet, definitely. Carl asks, what do we not yet know about ancient Egypt that you wish we could learn? Gosh. Things we don't already know that I wish we could learn. Let's see. I mean, I think personally, I'm not interested in how they built the pyramids or how did they do mummification, but maybe more about how, yeah, everyday life was. Maybe more in terms of how they thought about statues. Like, how did you personally, how do you go about buying, dedicating, venerating a statue in a temple? Because that was my PhD research. Fascinating. There's no, letter really saying how, this is what's going to happen to an object like a statue. And just getting a bit more sense of what objects, especially monuments, meant to people in ancient Egypt. That is something which we don't yet really know. We can infer from other sources. So I hope that satisfies all your questions. Thank you very much for tuning in. I think this worked okay once I relocated. Check me out on social media at EgyptMCR. The museum, Manchester Museum, is now sadly closed to the public, but we're trying to do stuff online. We're having pop-up exhibitions in different places. We currently have Egyptian material in our local central library. If you're a Manchester resident, you can check out some highlights of the Egyptology collection there. And our Golden Mummies of Egypt show is currently in Beijing. It will be traveling elsewhere in China. If you can get to China, I don't know how many viewers we have in China. But that exhibition will be coming back for the return of the mummies and indeed the Tutankhamun centenary in the autumn of next year. So probably by the end of October. So thank you very much for joining and see you all next month.